everyone. I'm Kelly Harrison, Associate and Creative Nonfiction Editor for West Trade Review. I want to welcome you to the newest installment of our Postscript interview series. Today, I'm talking with the author of Sedimentary, a creative nonfiction piece we're publishing in our summer 2023 edition, written by Nicole Desjardins Gowdy. Hello, Nicole. How are you?
Hi, Kelly. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for meeting with us. Let's start off by talking about the work itself. First, I want to talk about how you captured childhood memories. So can you talk a little bit about the details that you included in the story, how you captured those memories for this piece, and maybe a little bit about how the memories came?
Yeah. The memories were there. These are memories that really come to mind immediately for me when I think about this place and I think about spending time there and my family. I would say we spent as much time outside on the rocks as we did inside in the cabin in our time there. And so really just exploring and the magic and the mystery of the landscape and of the waterscape was a big part of my time in that place.
Very, very, I mean, it's very tangible, the fishing and the guts. And so is that something that just you think about a lot, or was it stuff that when you started, you knew you were going to write this piece and then the memory started coming back?
Yeah. I think the fishing is one of the fondest memories I have. My sister and I used to dig for worms on the beach and take them to the wharf with our little bamboo fishing rods with my dad and, hope to catch fish. And meanwhile, the folks with their more professional fishing rods would be there too. And then we would take them back and we would gut the fish on the rocks and, everything was there that we needed for that meal, our worms, our fish, our outdoor kitchen, so to speak. So all of that is just a really vivid and almost daily, if not weekly memory for me.
Yeah, that's great. So in this piece you write, I want to go from memories to time. So you write, time was removing our father from this world, from participant to observer. And I'm struck by how you encapsulate life, childhood, decline, and death, all of that time that passes for us. So maybe you can comment on working with time in narrative. How you because you're dealing with such a long time span. How did you pick here's a memory to craft that narrative time space?
I originally started writing this piece as part of a poetry class. So it just flowed out of me, these bits and pieces of memory and kind of the salient pieces of time in this story and in this life. And so it really was kind of going back and working through it again more intentionally that other things started to come up and then I worked them in. But these, for me, it was a little bit more of a kind of a natural process, almost a meditative process.
Okay, I like that meditative process. Can you explore that a little bit more? Maybe in terms of the poetry workshop that you were doing?
Yeah. So I actually, I came back to writing after a really long time away after my father's death. So I studied creative writing in college. I had always written growing up. I had notebooks. That's what I would do on a Saturday or Sunday. I'd make a little fort and write stories. And after college, and I just drifted away from writing, at least in kind of a more creative sense. And after my father passed, I felt a real sense of urgency to get things down on paper. And it was also for me a way to process the grief of his loss and kind of try to document the joy and the memories that we had from our time together. I've been thinking a lot about just what happens after someone dies, and their story can very easily end, right? They're not sharing their memories, they're not sharing their life. So who's doing that? And so for me, it's really trying to an exercise in digging back into my memories and bringing them back out into the light and onto paper.
Yeah, I think you did a really good job with that. So my question there is, if this was your father's death seems like it was sort of a catalyst for getting this creative juice back. Are you writing other pieces about your father?
I have, yeah. Some of them are still works in progress. There are some that are kind of, I'm blocked in certain ways. I've written others that have that are in various stages. But yeah, I think he is one of the big inspirations in my writing, or at least kind of when I return to writing. And I think he appears in small ways in some of the other things I'm working on as well.
Well, you just got a piece published in spring 2023 in another journal. I think it was a fiction piece. Can you tell us a little bit about the other kinds of writing that you're doing? I mean, you mentioned doing the poetry workshop. So you're kind of dabbling in a lot of different things, or do you feel like one of those genres is more the home for you?
Yeah, it's interesting because growing up, my genre was always fiction. That's, all my classes in college, I took fiction. That's what I wrote afterwards, aside from journaling and kind of documenting daily life. And when my father passed in the pandemic, I had very little time. I had a 3-year-old and a 1.5-year-old. I was trying to work a full-time job. My husband was trying to work a full-time job with no daycare. So I really gravitated more towards shorter forms. And that's where poetry came in. And I think poetry also allowed me to just kind of express myself in blurting out whatever came to mind, or blurting out whatever feelings that didn't have to connect in a coherent or full sentence kind of way. So when I returned to writing, I really started off with poetry. And when I wrote this piece, it really seemed like it wasn't quite a poem. And as I continued to work into it, that's when I realized it was kind of best serving me, or best being served as a creative nonfiction. And then I think that's been the surprising piece about this whole journey back into writing, is that I have had a much harder time writing fiction than I used to. That, like I said, that used to be my niche. And I found myself getting a little bit more back into fiction and allowing fiction to explore certain feelings or thoughts in a safer way, where I wasn't writing super personally about myself. The piece that came out in spring 2023 is not, it's not me, but it certainly reflects the angst of trying to parent in a pandemic and the demands of children on parents at a time where there was very little support and a lot of isolation.
Yeah, it's been a very trying period for everyone. But I noticed in that piece, as well as the one that we're publishing, that they both have this quality of memory and of childhood. That the other piece is dealing with kids kind of invading the space, and Sedimentary is these joyful moments as a child. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the influence of childhood in general on
Yeah.
your work.
Um,
And maybe you can also kind of talk a bit about some of the other works that you've published, the poetry, the fiction.
mhm.
Is that kind of a theme for you at all? Do you think?
That's a good question. I don't know that childhood is, but I think, it's interesting that you point out that connection between these two pieces. I think that perhaps in some ways, bringing the children in allows for a certain kind of freedom, right? It allows for exploration. It allows for kind of non-judgment of the writing, or just of the creative exploration in the space. A lot of the work that I've done since the pandemic has been around grief, has been around the body, has been around sort of the expectations of people and of everyday life. And I think this piece means a lot to me in the sense that this place that I described was a place that we would go to get away from it all. We didn't have internet. I don't even think we had like reception on the TV. So it really just was a place where we went to get back to a simpler time, a simpler place. My dad had a really large family, so we were spending a lot of time with his brothers and sisters and all of my cousins. So it really was kind of a reconnection back to my source and kind of what's most important. And I think for me, that is very much tied in with childhood, because that's where I was, or that's where it began for me. But I think it's about more than just kind of childhood. I think it really is more about kind of the source and what's most important.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah. And I think there's some interesting parallels too, because you're writing up about a time when you were a child in this piece. And then you said during the pandemic, trying to raise small children and the isolation. And there's some interesting tension that I'm starting to piece together from the piece that you wrote and some of your lived experience during the pandemic time, not only losing your father and having that bring up the childhood memories, but also maybe some compare and contrast between your childhood and your own children's childhood. And having that as a space to explore. So everybody always wants to hear about the writer's process. So I have to ask you some questions around that. How did the writing go for this personal piece? Maybe you can talk a little bit about when you first realized that this was the story you were going to tell, and how it unfolded. You said you started it in the poetry class, but maybe a little bit more in when did you know it wasn't a poem anymore? When did you, and I will say, maybe also bring us into the piece itself does have some enjambment and some line breaks similar to a poem. So maybe you can talk a bit about that.
Yeah. I think I was trying to write it as a poem, and the prose just came out, right? And it didn't quite fit into traditional prose poem forms as I understand them. And I was really fortunate. The instructor of the class, Michael Torres, who's a really terrific poet, he offered to give feedback, and the questions I posed to him, he didn't quite answer. And so it really, I guess he answered a lot of the questions. The question he didn't quite answer was, is it a poem or is it something else? And I think the fact that I had to keep asking it was instructive to me that, no, I actually don't think this is a poem. And so it allowed me to trust my intuition and explore in a larger format, which actually opened up a lot more possibility to me, because I was really trying to work in these very small formats that were not very time consuming, that I didn't have to put a lot of words into or pages into. And when I started to explore where else this could go, it really allowed more imagery to come in. It allowed a lot more of the history and of sort of the place to come in a, I guess, less abstract way, in a more concrete way. So I think that was just kind of taking the limitations off trying to define what it was, helped me to create it into what it ended up being. And then I set a genre on it after the fact.
Yeah. And so then setting the genre on it after the fact, did that force you to do any revisions, or was it, oh, now I have this piece, aha, I know what it is?
I think I by that point, by the time I had decided it was creative nonfiction, it had already revealed itself to me as creative nonfiction.
Yeah. Now maybe you can talk a little bit about the process with this piece and the process with other pieces. You talked just a second ago about this sort of freedom of being able to explore, let yourself find what the piece is trying to say. Has that been the process for the other works that you've recently published, or is this sort of it's a new thing, new sort of process?
Mm-hmm. I think for me, one of the biggest pieces of my process that's very new for me is the patience it takes to revise. Um, I've always been someone who just wants to throw some words on paper and walk away. And to have the patience to really look at it, to seek feedback. I have some writing partners that I was regularly writing with and that we still meet to give each other feedback on our work, and to try to get a few different perspectives, but also to have the discernment about what is really important to me and what am I trying to say in the piece. I think that has been a new part of my process to really accept revision and to continue seeing a piece through to where it might want to go, as opposed to just walking away and saying, okay, I'm done with that. I'm ready to move on to the next thing.
Yeah, that's I think that's one of the things reading the works that come into us. We can see a lot of those where the author has resisted going back and doing some deeper revision, even though there's a really good nugget and we can see where the story is coming from. So I'm glad that you brought that up, because hopefully some people who are watching this will say, oh, okay, maybe I need to go back in and revise a little bit more. Tell us a little bit about the emotional process. And I don't want to get too deep, but in sense of when you're writing that emotional process, not necessarily this piece in particular, but your works, I think all good fiction gets at some emotional core truth. Is that core truth present to you throughout, or does that also, like the story itself, get revealed to you slowly through the writing and revising?
The writing that I've been doing lately is really just coming from the heart. And so there is a core truth that's trying to speak its way through my pen or through my keyboard. And I think this piece in particular for me, every time I don't think I felt very emotional when I was writing it. And I didn't really know where it was going when I would write it. But every time I would read back through it in all of its iterations, that the last line was the piece that really got to me and was the big surprise and kind of the reveal for me as I was writing, because it kind of brought home this idea of, starting off. I mean, my sister and I could watch these tide pools for hours. There was just this whole scene happening in them. And to kind of bring it back around with the same image, except a different connotation of the world, right? That my father, that this person who had meant the world to me, who was a whole world for me, is now contained in the small pool. That to me was something that was just a really interesting kind of piece to come back to through the writing.
Yeah, and it is an amazing ending to the piece. So I'd like to thank you for doing this interview with us, and I encourage everybody to stick around and listen to you read the piece for us. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Kelly, for having me. My name is Nicole Desjardins Gowdy, and this is Sedimentary. The rocks outside my father's cabin held small worlds in their tide pools. On the sides of the pools, the inland landscape was rendered in miniature. Faint green and brown algae grew in patterns of pastures, dotted with tiny snails like hay bales. As children, my sister and I were captivated by the worlds they contained, secrets hidden at high tide and revealed when the river retreated. We would squat over the tide pools, pick the snails from the dry rocks, and drop them back in. Freshwater shrimp darted through the seaweed that grew from the crevices, the air brined with ancestry. When he was a child himself, this small town, the Seaway, was our father's whole world. As an adult, it was the place he returned to every summer to recharge with the sea's energy and to relax in the embrace of the green coastal landscape. His cabin was nestled on rocky land facing the St. Lawrence River, a wall of pines climbing the ridge behind it. Beyond that was the town with the commanding stone church's silver-painted dome and 4 bell towers rising above the surrounding farmland. Our father, who knew the secrets the landscape kept, the cave at the end of the lane that once refrigerated the perishables, the car that went off the wharf with its passengers still inside. Our father, who had jumped off the wharf to try to save the passengers, who many years later leapt off again to rescue the doll I dropped while watching the ferry arrive. Our father brought us into his world every summer, shared these secrets with us, just as he taught us to fish from the wharf, to clean smelt on the rocks, tossing heads and guts to the gulls. Our father led us over the rocks every day to bathe in the sea, cold as it was, as he had done as a child with his own siblings. When they came to visit, they went out together and had contests to see who could stay in the longest. It was always my father, swimming out in the deep water with long, sure strokes. Each day, my sister and I ran across the rocks down the shore to our uncles' and aunts' cabins, hardening the soles of our feet. We climbed the rocks to their back doors and walked into small rooms filled with light and smoke and laughter, warmed with the joys of summer and gathering from far away. As teenagers, we no longer wanted to brave the cold water the way he would, and we stopped swimming. Our father stubbornly continued to make his way to the water alone, even as he lost sensation in his feet from diabetes, even as he began to lose his balance. To retain this small pleasure, this small pride, he rented a cement mixer and paved an uneven path from the steps to the shore. When he could no longer cross the rocks, he sat in his chair behind the large window, glancing every now and then from his Sudoku to the sea. It was our turn to lead our children to the water, to teach them to notice the salt and breeze on their faces, the rough stone under their feet, and the chill of the water around their ankles. Time was removing our father from this world, from participant to observer. What is he now? When dementia became a veil through which he viewed the world, our father could no longer visit the cabin. His mind came and went like the tides. After he passed, we took his ashes back, packed in a plastic box. For nearly 2 years during the pandemic, the box, like my father, sat eternally patient in my parents' living room. Finally, reunited, we returned him home to the sea. We took him out on the rocks and released him for one final swim, but the ashes blew back over us in the salty, wet wind. A dusting collected on a wet spot on my jacket right over my heart. When I tried to wipe it off, it soaked in deeper, an indelible mark. We realized the waves wouldn't reach us at mid-tide, and we watched as the ashes clung to the rocks and settled at the bottom of a tide pool. Where is he now? Surely the tide returned for him that night. But maybe a trace remains nestled in a crevice, keeping company with the seaweed and the snails and with the echoes of his daughters, noticing how a small pool can contain a whole world.